Welcome to the 2025 Kaldor Centre Conference. I'm Daniel Ghezelbash, the Director of the Kaldor Centre for International Refugee Law. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Bidjigal people who are the traditional custodians of this land, and I pay my respects to their elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people with us here today. I also recognize the unique role that First Nations people have played in welcoming refugees and people seeking asylum to their lands. I also want to recognize those of us joining us today who have first-hand experience of forced migration. This includes our founding donors, Andrew and Renata Kaldor, and we extend our thanks to them and to those with us who so generously support the work of the Centre, whether through your donations, your collaboration, or attending events such as this one. Our hope is that today's conference can act as a vital catalyst for principled action at a moment of profound uncertainty and opportunity. Through exchange, rigorous debate, and the foregrounding of lived experience, the intention is to not only build a shared sense of understanding, but to inspire bold collective action that advances protection for refugees and other forced migrants. This aligns with the Kaldor Centre's mission to be a catalyst for evidence-based change, bridging advocacy and research, law and lived experience, policy and practice, to imagine a future where humane and sustainable responses to forced migration are possible. The theme, Building Bridges, Advancing Refugee Protection in a Divided World, could not be more timely, encapsulating both the urgency but also the opportunity of the moment we find ourselves in. We meet at a crossroads for refugee protection. Around the world, displacement has reached record highs, with more than 122 million people displaced from their homes, including over 31 million refugees. Devastating conflicts are raging in so many parts of the world. Some are receiving prominent coverage, some are neglected. All are utterly tragic. From the destruction in Gaza and the ongoing war in Ukraine, to the brutal conflicts in Sudan and Myanmar, and the deepening humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, the scale of displacement and human suffering is staggering. At the same time, division is deepening, funding is contracting, and populist rhetoric is surging, shrinking the space for humane, coordinated responses just when they're needed most. Refugees and migrants are too often scapegoated for economic, security, and cultural anxieties, made into easy targets when the real causes for these issues go unaddressed. Recent global developments remind us how fragile and contested refugee protection has become. The United States, under President Trump, has dramatically cut international aid / funding for UNHCR and reduced resettlement opportunities. It's also floated reforms that would undermine the very foundations of the international protection regime. Yet it's vital that we don't lose sight of reality. The biggest problems confronting refugee protection are not flaws in the Refugee Convention, but flaws in implementation and a lack of political will. The Refugee Convention, rooted in the long-standing institution of asylum, offers the states the very predictability and stability needed to balance sovereignty with humanitarian obligation, respecting national interests while ensuring access to safety and dignity for those fleeing persecution. This framework has enabled millions of refugees, including my own family, to find security and rebuild their lives. But recent years have seen many states deliberately undermine this framework. Instead of honoring the spirit of their international obligations towards refugees, many governments have exploited legal gaps and ambiguities, redefining territory and jurisdiction, constructing legal fictions that treat asylum seekers as if they're not present, and legislating away what they see as inconvenient safeguards. This has been fueled in part by a strategy of hyperlegalism, where states adopt bad faith interpretations of their international obligations. In this way, states pay lip service to their international obligations while at the same time applying them in ways that undermine access to asylum and fundamental rights. The result is an architecture of exclusion. Externalization policies such as interceptions, pushbacks, and extraterritorial processing, and third country transfers block access to protection. Even for those who do arrive, underfunded, overstretched, and often unfair asylum procedures too often deny people a fair hearing. These approaches produce the very failures now being cited by some to justify reforms to the international protection regime. Slow, inconsistent processing, long delays, inequitable responsibility sharing, loss of public trust, and suffering of those seeking safety. Disturbingly, some states aren't even trying to pay lip service to international obligations, with the very spirit and letter of those laws now being openly targeted. Some have argued the Refugee Convention has run its course and must be replaced or amended. The Trump administration recently set out its own new principle to guide future reform, including requiring asylum seekers to claim protection in the first country they enter, offering only temporary protection, and expanding powers for removal and deportation. Some well-intentioned actors have joined the chorus for reform based on a belief that compromise and concessions are required to head off more radical proposals. But as Filippo Grandi, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, has warned, putting the Refugee Convention and the principle of asylum on the table would be a catastrophic error. In the face of attacks on the very foundations of the international protection regime, defending its core principles is not head-in-the-sand wishful thinking. It's an act of leadership that these times demand. It arises from clear-eyed accounting of where the failures of the system lie, not in the Convention, but in the absence of good faith implementation of its principles on the parts of states. But that is not to say that fresh thinking is not required. There are genuine challenges that require collective efforts to address. Slow and inconsistent procedures, chronic underfunding, and unequal responsibility sharing are undermining both the integrity of the system and public trust. In this environment, populist narratives thrive, offering easy villains instead of workable solutions. And this is precisely why building bridges is so essential. If our challenge is one of division, then our response must be one of connection, between truth and empathy, between governments and communities, between those seeking protection and those offering it. Because the path forward is not rewriting the Refugee Convention, but rebuilding the trust, cooperation, and fairness on which it depends. Building bridges requires more honest and effective communication, addressing the real challenges facing asylum systems and refugee protection more broadly, while simultaneously counteracting exaggerations and misinformation. It means focusing our collective effort on implementation rather than abandoning principles, developing fair and fast procedures while fostering greater solidarity and responsibility sharing. It requires reframing refugee protection not only as an act of obligation, but of shared opportunity. Refugees bring skills, resilience, knowledge, and enterprise that enrich societies. Proof that when protection is upheld, everyone gains. And finally, building bridges requires recognizing and elevating refugee expertise and leadership. People with lived experience of displacement understand the problems with our system and the solutions needed to overcome them. When their leadership helps to shape policy and practice, refugee protection becomes not only more effective, but more just and enduring. Bridge building, in this sense, is not abstract. It's an approach grounded in partnership, connecting governments, local communities, practitioners, people with lived experience to co-design solutions that are both principled and workable. In an age of polarization, this is how we reclaim the space for principled action and demonstrate that humanity and effectiveness can and must go hand in hand. Before we dive into today's program, it's important to recognize that the issues we'll be discussing are complex, sensitive, and deeply felt. For many here, the conversations are tied to personal histories and experiences of both pain and resilience. There will inevitably be a diversity of views in the room, some openly visible, others quietly held. And that diversity is what makes this dialogue so meaningful. Part of this forum's role is to create a space for conversations that may be challenging. Good faith engagement with difficult topics is essential for bridging divides, even in the presence of deep disagreement. Our request to everyone, both here and online, is to approach discussion with empathy and care. Please recognize the diversity of perspectives present and remember the real human impact behind the issues that we'll be discussing. Our aim is not to resolve all the differences in one day, but to model respectful engagement. Disagreement is allowed and even expected. But our hope is that through listening and thoughtful exchange, we foster learning, connection, and mutual respect. The conference program sets out these engagement guidelines to ensure the event is welcoming and accessible to all. If at any point you need to take a break, there's a quiet space outside the foyer. For anyone who feels distressed or needs support, two support people from our team, Madeline Gleason from the Kaldor Centre and Linda Bartolome from the Forced Migration Research Network, are on hand and identifiable by the yellow badges. While not trained counselors, they're your first point of contact, and if specialized support would be helpful, our partners at STARTS have their clinical staff available today, and Linda and Madeline can connect you with them. Let's commit together to making today a space where difficult but necessary conversations can happen, where every voice is valued, and where we truly build bridges. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our opening keynote speaker, Mohammed Naeem. As Senior Director for Advocacy Strategy at Refugees International, Mohammed leads efforts to build partnerships and strategies that unite policymakers, advocates, and communities in advancing refugee protection worldwide. He currently serves on the Advisory Board on Public Issues for the Ad Council, the Advisory Board for Pathways International, the Board of Directors for Refugee Council USA, and is the inaugural chair of the United States Refugee Advisory Board. His career, from the American Immigration Council to More in Common, has been dedicated to bridging divides, fostering collaboration, and reimagining how we communicate about migration and belonging in polarized times. Having grown up in New York after his family fled Afghanistan, Mohammed brings both professional and lived expertise to this conversation. That perspective informs his deep commitment to ensuring that refugee protection is grounded in inclusion, dignity, and the voices of those most affected. Today, he joins us to open our discussions on how, in an era of deep polarization, we can strengthen the human connections, trust, and cooperation that effective refugee protection requires. Following his remarks, Mohammed will be taking questions, and a reminder that you can send those through Slido throughout the discussion, but we'll also be taking questions from the floor. Now, please join me in welcoming Mohammed to the stage. Thank you so much, Mohammed.
Okay. Let me start off by just sharing a very good morning, dear colleagues and friends. There's many friends here out in the audience today. It is such a tremendous honor for me to be here amongst each of you today, one that I don't take for granted at all. Before I do begin, though, I would like to just express my deep gratitude to you, Daniel, to Francis, really the whole of the Kaldor Centre team for your hospitality and really for the gift of giving me the opportunity to share this room with such an esteemed group of advocates and doers. These are very difficult times. That's obvious. So back when I was in college, I had stumbled on a quote that's become so central to my own identity and my thinking as I've navigated my own professional life. There are leaders, and then there are those who lead. I am entirely partial towards the latter, of course, and I know that this is a room and a center that since 2013 has been committed to growing the scholarship of leadership across our space, here in Sydney, across Australia, and certainly across the world. Never before has leading in verb form been more vital to the prospects of our work. And it is also directly proportional, I think, to the persuasive quality of our ideas. Ideas that are being tested, challenged, compromised. So I'd like to start today by also reminding myself a wisdom that I was given years ago. And Daniel had alluded to this just earlier. Speeches should not be something we give, but rather something we share. And so in that spirit, I do welcome hearty dialogue during the Q&A session. And really, these remarks are simply to set up, they serve as an appetizer to be able to set up a lively discussion soon after. Sydney holds a very special place in my heart because from where I grew up, which is a small Afghan refugee community and baked in the borough of Queens, New York, Sydney was just a fixture of my imagination. Seen through the blurry images of my 13-inch television screen in my bedroom on New Year's Eve as fireworks streaked and climbed into the skies above your harbor, since the future always arrives earlier here in Sydney. And so when my life was bound just between the borders of a few blocks, really this became the only portal through which I imagined a life beyond. And so that's to say, at that time, imagination costed me nothing then, but it means everything to me now. And although the times are uniquely difficult for each of us, for those we advocate with, for our friends and our colleagues, and most honestly for displaced people here and everywhere, I remind myself that this is work. Our journey is generational. So I refuse to let today's mere seconds of uncertainty steal away the minutes and the hours of the future we're all wanting to realize. Imagination, I believe, can serve as a connective tissue, a means through which we bridge from here towards anywhere. And I'm deliberately using the word imagination as an anchor because it is a methodology more than it is a word, that we can organize ourselves around this time and at this place. It is indeed a methodology that has been employed by displaced people who see in their hopes a real chance that someday, that one day, they find what they had sought. And if we are asking of them to remain hopeful and patient, then we must have the gumption and the courage to remain so ourselves, especially during these times. Now, let me be also clear. I know that what I'm asking is not easy. Our politics have led us into an era of recessive policymaking, as Daniel had noted. That remains true across every corner of our planet. It is driven in large part by demographic and ethnographic anxieties that have been triggered and falsehoods that have chiseled perceptions into extremism. I do fear that if we don't chart a recourse, it may well lead to the flatlining, not so much of the protection regime, but of the character of the decision-making in our system, and undermine its core tenet to protect, to safeguard, and most importantly, to welcome. And that, dear friends, has consequences far beyond this room today. The theme of today's conference, Building Bridges, is a rather insightful and timely choice. And for the better part of my career, I've attempted to translate its meaning and infuse its lofty wisdom into the heart of my legislative and political work. Our world is not just contending with a historic level of displacement across borders. It is also in parallel contending with a greater degree of fastening, of misalignment, of trust, of understanding within our own societies and across governments and multilateral institutions. Echo chambers that seem to grow larger with even lesser overlap. When you combine that with the nature of our politics and the narrowing of our policymaking, it has fractured our ability to agree on fundamental basic realities. What constitutes a refugee? What are our obligations under the Convention and international law? And what is fact versus fiction? When we lose sense of shared facts, we also undermine the ethos of shared responsibilities. And yet, while some may see this as a reckoning, I see this moment a bit differently. Instead, as an invitation to lean into complexity, to solve through the ambiguity, to encode our vision, your vision, into the makings of what our system becomes. But to do so in a way that endures, in a way that's real and practical and honest, we must first name what we are truly facing together. Now, I can stand here and speak to you about the extraordinary gaps in funding that UNHCR faces, which is real, and it does, or how the Trump administration's actions have led to the dismantling of the global aid infrastructure, which it has, or the growing attacks on asylum, which is happening in real time, each and every day, by both signatories and non-signatories to the convention. However, these are merely pit stops in policymaking. They are not finish lines. I think that's important. They are merely pit stops. They are not finish lines. I believe that the larger challenge for us to wrestle with truly is ideologically epistemic, meaning we are reckoning with the crisis of truth and trust. And that is born from the slow but steady and simmering tearing apart of our ability to sit with discomfort, in the discomfort of having to massage through disagreement and difference. It has shaped a certain kind of moral economy that seems capitalistic towards quick returns on righteousness. Being ideologically right may sometimes be practically ineffective. And the danger is this leads to a greater degree of polarization that warps our political standing, but it also, more fundamentally, erodes our competence, our efficacy in shaping solutions to match the demands of tomorrow. So if this is a moment that we've inherited, then leadership, real, verb-formed leadership requires something entirely countercultural, the discipline to rebuild consensus, to bridge in an age that profits from breaking. So how do we shift course? Well, let's start exactly where our feet are. As I consider the overall scope of the architecture that we operate in and our roles individually and as organizations, our roles in it, I'm reminded daily that the refugee protection system is not centralized around a single UN agency, or a single border crossing, or a single admission or complementary program. It is a breathing web of laws, of institutions, of organizations, of norms, people, local, national, international. The temptation towards centralization serves no good, as we've seen in our policymaking over the last year with the withdrawal of the United States, leaving massive gaps. When so much of the work of protection and integration happens in localized contexts, in the hands of municipalities, of civil society, schools, neighbors, and the refugees themselves, the next evolution of the system won't come from Canberra, New York, Geneva, or Washington alone. It will come from communities, like the more than 170 refugee welcome zones across Australia, for example, that have learned how to do the hard generational work of welcome with both structure and spirit. This reframe, in the most obvious and mundane sense, is just simply logistics that have worked, do work, and will continue to work for the rest of time. I think sometimes it's helpful to go to the most elemental nature of our work. Which brings me to my next point. Our societies aren't as polarized as their politicians. That may seem to come as a surprise, but across the spectrum of ideology and identity, across our nations, most citizens actually still agree that families should be safe, that rules should be fair, and that countries have an obligation to be welcoming. The data on this is actually quite clear. In the United States, it is true for America, as it is for Australia, as it is for Europe, and the world over, with sizable majorities, in fact, supporting resettlement and protection. The challenge is to learn how to harness that data. And on that, I believe that our job is not to convince people to care. It is to show that caring works. The best narratives, the ones that have stickiness factor, are simply good policies made visible and are materially felt, which over time, I think fundamentally readjusts two things. One, the calculus around policymaking. Precisely because, and two, because of the realignment in public attitudes that shape our politics. Our politics are shaped by public attitudes that then shape our policies. This narrativizing, this telling of the story, making good policy visible, cannot happen if refugees and their contributions are made invisible. The erasure of refugees, even the limiting of it, in fact, frankly hides the evidence of what works. Greater visibility, including on our organizational charts, is not charity, it is strategy. And it's evidence of generational work realized in the most proximal form. Our institutions can choose to become such an access point in actualizing what is already in principle. And so with this, I'd like to land on just some reflections of my last few years having been traveling across between Geneva, New York, Washington, and elsewhere. And I'll never forget, this is off the cuff, off the remarks, I'll never forget my experience a couple years ago on October 7th. So on October 7th, I was getting on a flight to go to Geneva for the UNHCR Executive Committee meeting. And I was at JFK Airport, and I ended up not fully realizing what had happened. And I got on my flight, and I got in the next morning, on that Sunday morning. And I had realized the gravity of the moment that we were in. And I was serving on the US government delegation. And so on that Monday morning, I saw our government acting in real time at a moment of extraordinary catastrophe. And I also saw decisions being made so quickly, so rapidly, without the kind of strategic foresight that I think you need to be able to think 2, 3, 4, 5 months in advance, 1 year, 2 years in advance. And I remember thinking at that time, as my government was making extraordinarily quick decisions right in front of me, I remember thinking at that time, the power, not of the people who are leaders, but the power in the people around them who shape what it is that their policy became. And in that moment, our president, President Biden, had also shared that he was going to inject human rights into the heart of our foreign policy. And that was a moment when the moral economy didn't quite add up. It didn't make a lot of sense. And as I think about what was needed in that moment, I wished and I hoped that governments, that institutions, that our communities had invested much more deeply in the makings of mechanisms and pathways that expanded refugee leadership across the spaces that we were operating in. And the reason for that is because naturally we are gifted communities who have faced that trial, who have seen those bombs, who have traveled those lands. They have a level of strategic foresight that can iron out the real knots that policymaking has produced and has created during our times. And as we face this extraordinary recessive moment, I think it is vital, foundational, strategic, consequentially important that we continue to build mechanisms that enables our communities to put our best foot forward, and that showcases the evidence of the evidence that the policies that we have been building and the infrastructure that we have been creating actually has materially advanced not just the plight of refugees themselves and of displaced people, but of the whole of society. Because if we cannot make the case for the whole of society, then I fear, in fact, that the very nefarious forces that Daniel has been talking about are going to continue to edge out the rhetoric and to edge us out narratively. And so we have an opportunity, but more importantly, we have a choice. And we can claim that choice at this moment when, in fact, there might be evidence, despite evidence to the contrary. And so let me bring you back from where I grew up. As I said, I grew up in a small refugee community in Queens, New York. So much of what I learned about people, about institutions, comes from that place. And as I reflect on the places I've been, the ornate halls, the grand events, the panels and the this and the that, I realize that it was me in those rooms, but it could also have been anybody else in that space. And that so much of what my mother taught me, of what my father taught me about negotiation, or what my mother taught me about compassion, or what my community taught me about hospitality and respect, so much of what I learned as a professional did not come from university. It in fact came from the very place and space of community in which I built. And so that's to say that we can only be where our feet are, and we can only build where our feet are. And that's the work that I've committed my life to. And it's something that I think if we all do together, that we will end up in a place, in a space far better in the years, in the months, and certainly in the years ahead. I welcome a spirited discussion on any bit of the policymaking you'd want to ask your questions about. But thank you so much for having me, and let's get to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. I really could not have imagined a better opening keynote to frame the themes and issues that we're going to be unpacking further throughout today. We're going to open up to questions shortly. Reminder that you could send those in through Slido, and also we'll be taking questions from the floor. So I really am agreeing. I like this sort of framing around the need to build consensus. And I also agree with you that there's the foundation to do that is these real shared values that we see out there. But what I see as the challenge there, though, is the lack of shared facts.
Right.
And so I want to ask you, is it possible to build consensus around shared values where we can't seem to agree on the facts?
No. No, it's not. I think part of it is because, well, there's a few things I'd like to mention on that. One is that we are operating in an extraordinarily complicated and nuanced informational environment. I spent the last 5 years conducting fairly sophisticated psychographic and media research to help shape large-scale communication efforts, to the tune of like tens of millions of dollars. And what I learned actually was that it was so hard, so very difficult to penetrate the media environment, and particularly the media ecosystems in which some of the more sort of moderate-leaning or maybe some of the more conservative-leaning audiences were sort of baked into. And we were spending an extraordinary sum of money to increasingly try to sort of reach in just a sliver of the American audience, of the American public. And the reason it was so difficult, because the media environment historically has relied on a certain sort of architecture, broadcast journalism, broadcast television, basically big conglomerate like distribution verticals and pathways. You no longer have that. You have thousands of micro informational kind of ecosystems and chambers and environments. the people who are most trusted are not actually leaders of institutions. They're not even government. In fact, they are influencers. There are people who talk about selling shoes, but also do so in a way to talk about their politics. And so I think that really poses a challenge. And so as a result, if that informational ecosystem is shaping the sort of the material character of what is fact versus what is fiction, then that just warrants a greater study and a greater examination. I say that because that's how so much of public opinion is now being formed. And so then you come into a space where if you don't establish a shared sense of facts, then you're operating in entirely different ecosystems. Where I have found this to be really, really challenging is when we do so much of our advocacy in Washington, particularly with the U.S. Congress, those sort of altered facts, per se, facts, actually do make its way into the legislative process. It is remarkable to sit in front of legislators and their staffs, repeat back to you the very falsehoods that you have read about and studied and actually dispelled. But they are materially changing the sort of the tone and the tenor of the legislative process. And so I think, where does that leave us? It leaves us actually with a few different realities. One is that if legislation is being built on an alternative reality, then we are really warped in terms of how it is that sort of we move forward. And I think that actually further reaffirms and reinforces the practicality of bridge building and the need to be able to sort of merge consensus, but more importantly, to create dialogue and discussion with and amongst audiences that fundamentally do disagree with us. We might not share the same facts all the time, but at least we can engage in a substantive discussion that I hope will shape the process of dialogue in each of our societies, in each of our countries. And so that is why when we engage on the Hill or when we engage Congress, we engage Republican offices as much as we possibly can, as we would do with Democratic offices. And in fact, I once had a Democratic staffer once said to me, a Republican staffer once say to me, "You never reach out. You never actually engage us in your advocacy. So if you don't engage our camp in your advocacy, what do you expect from us?" And so we have sort of realigned the kind of the processing of how we do our work in the hopes that we can get to some kind of shared sentiment around not facts, but actually solutions and sort of like legislations. And so those are the two ends of it, I think. One is the sort of the informational kind of reality that we're operating in, and another is actually changing our political and advocacy posture, which is easier said than done.
Do you have any examples that you can draw on where you've kind of changed that posture and it's been effective?
Yeah, I mean, so even in the midst of kind of the reality of, the United States, like the dismantling of USAID does very directly undermine the whole of the global aid architecture. I mean, I cannot say that enough. It really fundamentally changes the calculus for local communities and countries across the world. One example is that we've had to pick and choose our spots a little bit in our advocacy. And so, for example, on Sudan being the world's worst humanitarian crisis on earth, and the way in which that civil war has expanded to other parts, and even across the border into Chad, for example. The committees of jurisdiction in Congress are the Senate Foreign Relations Committees and the House Foreign Affairs Committees and then the subcommittees on Africa. Now, because Republicans control all levers of power in Washington, they also control the committee assignments in terms of who has leadership stake in it. And so we've actually worked, for example, in engaging in a pretty kind of like methodical way, our Republican leadership on the House and the Senate sort of subcommittees on Africa to specifically advocate around solutions for Sudan in particular. And this might come as a surprise. We've had more substantive engagement with the Republican leadership on Sudan than even the Democratic leadership. It's just because we realized that is an issue that we can actually have some shared sense of reality around. And it was actually a priority for previous Republican leadership and actually like the administration writ large. And so for us, we are not wanting to get caught around issues that are so deeply politicized and political. We want to substantively shift into a solutions mechanism, and we do so by engaging Republican leadership on issues that we feel we have some shared interest in. And so that has allowed us to be able to engage, like Senator Cruz, for example, and just other Republican legislators on both the House and the Senate sides, in actually materially advancing this issue all the way to the levels of the White House, so that they're able to at least keep the spigot on for Sudan in terms of just as an example. But obviously that is one amongst many issues that they fundamentally have walked away from.
Yeah, and that connects very directly to one of the questions we've had on Slido, which is where they say, you said our job is not to convince people to care, it's to show that caring works. How do you make that real in your work with the US Congress these days? Yeah, well, that's a question that's going to keep me up at night. So it's to show that caring works. And we were talking about this on the Uber ride here. And this is just my own perspective on the matter. It's not RI's perspective on the matter. The nationalizing of refugee policy, I don't know if that's worked. And what I mean by that is that national politics are naturally very different than proximal politics. See, elected officials and leaders and organizations, they have to respond to what's on their block, to what's in their community. Employment needs, safety and security needs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. National politics may be about slogans. Local politics are about solutions to problems. And I think by nationalizing our advocacy architecture, we may have missed the opportunity or are missing the opportunity to actually amplify what is fundamentally working in local community. See, the Trump administration making decisions about completely dismantling the US refugee admissions program to 7,500 slots only for Afrikaners versus 100,000 refugees that were resettled in the last year of the Biden administration. That flies in the face of the data and the evidence. But we really didn't do a good job at telling that story. And it's because the national advocacy architecture continued, rightly so, to want to advance and grow the system, and I get that. But at the same time, evidence only becomes evidence if you're able to articulate and narrativize it for the country at large, and really for local elected officials and local advocates. I fundamentally believe that in an era where nationalistic policymaking ends up leading to the kind of sort of warped discourse that we have around these issues, localizing that narrative may be a bit boring, but boring works in this circumstance. And in fact, that can serve as a forcing function to shape the tone and the tenor of the way in which national figures are talking about it, because the fact that it's local populations that end up in a democracy having to vote for their leadership. And so the way that we at RI are not, we don't work in local context in that way, but what we're trying really, really hard to do is to connect that story-making mechanism, to connect the evidence base in those local contexts, to be able to shape the national discourse, and in that way. And so when we meet with legislators, when we meet with multilateral institutions, when we engage at those levels, we always make sure that we have in that room the kind of representative leadership that can speak to proximal realities far better than we can. Because if you don't have that in those rooms that you're engaging in, you are losing a massive slice of the evidence base. We are not the evidence base. The evidence base exists in local communities. And so they have to, in the same way that we want refugee leaders to be in those rooms and to create mechanisms for that, we also have a responsibility to create mechanisms that allows the amplification of local actors to be in the kinds of spaces that we have the privileges of being part of. And I don't see that enough. I don't see it in Geneva. I don't see it in capitals. I don't see it at the Global Refugee Forum. I certainly don't see it at XCOM. I think that is a really big, powerful missing link here in a way that I think can improve conditions on the ground. So that's how I would answer that question. Thanks so much, Mohammed. I'm going to take one more question from Slido, but then we'll open up to the floor after that. So get your questions ready. And I think we kind of stay on a similar theme here, which we have a question about that says, do you have any thoughts on the reasons that politicians are more polarized than their communities? And how can we go about bringing the two closer together?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, why are politicians increasingly polarized? And there might be differences, obviously, in the United States versus here in Australia and maybe in Europe and otherwise. I think part of it has to do with the fact that, at least in the US context, it's different for parties, I would say. Polarization works. It really works. Like, it is really straightforward. The greater degree to which you can polarize a society, the greater degree of consolidated support you can build for your cause. There's a value proposition there for them. And so the value proposition is that when you can consolidate that level of support, that energy, that consolidated, calcified energy, often ends up with those very same individuals politically mobilizing for you, politically voting for you, keeping you in power, keeping you in the seat. And so naturally, that's a driving function for why politicians continue to lean into sort of some of that rhetoric. But the harder work, I think, and the more long-term generational work, is to politically mobilize individuals and communities who are not so deeply ingrained in the political kind of meatpacking. And what I mean by that is that most Western societies are governed effectively, the narrativizing around these issues are governed by fringe camps on both the left and the right. But they completely monopolize the discourse on these issues. There is a vast grouping, a number of segments across each of our societies that are not politically active. But contrary to thought, they're also the most diverse segments of any one of our societies. The fringe groups are actually the most well-to-do. They're the widest segments. They're the highest net worth segments. Effectively, there's no risk profile for them to be ideologically calcified. Their lives and their families are not at risk. That's the truth of the matter. The most diverse segments across our societies are actually 2 to 3 segments that are not politically active. They're most diverse. But importantly, there's a certain sort of challenge with them. One is because they don't politically lean in, it's harder to reach them. But if you can reach them, that expands the we. The challenge for us is how do we create a process and a politics where we are able to harness the expansion of that we. Politicians will not direct their energies on that segment of our populations because the return on investment won't be seen for generations. If you see your work as generationally, then that is precisely the segment that I think that we should invest our energies around. The reason being is because increasingly, if we keep tearing ourselves apart, then naturally that segment is also going to be torn apart. And what we have seen across Germany with the rise of the AfD, we know what's happening in France with the downgrading of the government, the prime minister. We see it in the United States. We see it maybe in bits and pieces here in Australia and otherwise. That when you don't create space for that substantive, thoughtful dialogue with those segments of each of your population sets, then what naturally starts to create is you start to see a receding of that segment into some of the more fringe camps. And if that happens over time, that is a deliberate choice that we are making and a calculated risk that we are taking, that our camp is going to be bigger than their camp. And it's important not to speak in us and them in this context. So we have a choice, actually, right now. Either we continue to invest in the calculating echo chambers that dominate our politics, or we can choose to maneuver our politics in a way that is more inward facing but it's much, much more difficult to actualize. But if you actualize it, it actually will end up feasibly changing the quality of your legislative process and, of course, your politics over time.
Can you point to any examples that you've seen that be done well, sort of targeting the center and mobilizing the center?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. I mean, part of it is, again, like when we were, so one of the big things in the United States, and many organizations are working on this, and this actually goes to the heart of refugee leadership and MRP and not just other issues, is that when you ask a basic question on, say, support for refugee resettlement in the United States, and often for someone who has a relationship with a refugee versus someone who does not have a relationship with a refugee, the differences are actually quite stark in this matter. And the thing about, our pipeline and where refugees have resettled across the United States is they are often resettled in places far, far away from New York City, from Washington, from Los Angeles, from all the major Democratic blue cities. They have resettled in Wichita, Kansas, in Alabama, in Mississippi, in spaces and places that, frankly, not a lot of people think about. And so part of, and often in those places and spaces, you don't have the kind of sort of fringe audience makeup. And so there has been a very deliberate, a very targeted effort to ensure that we are creating programs and pipelines and experiences in those contexts that allows the cross-bridge nature of having refugee communities more substantively engaged with sort of host communities and native communities to that place and space. And the thinking there is that the degree to which we are able to unblur those lines, we hope that over time that does change both the perceptions of refugees, but I think more importantly, those communities and host communities then have a real stake in them seeing their own communities as a place of welcoming. And so I know that has been a core complement and a core kind of attribute and variable that both resettlement agencies have been thinking quite a lot about. We have been certainly thinking a lot about. But the challenge for us is only about a third of the United States actually reports having a relationship with, say, a refugee. And so can we get that number from 30% to a much, much higher number? And in that, we hope that creates a societal-wide conversation rather than a very, very binary one in very small pockets of the United States.
Yeah, and we'll be talking more about the community sponsorship in the panels that follow. And again, that is a perfect example of putting these thoughts into practice.
Yeah, and in fact, the political calculus for creating that program in the United States was because of this data that had been infusing into the strategic makeup of that program. And I think that's exactly the underlying theory. The underlying theory being is that if you have communities self-choose for themselves to do this, then that actually tells you quite a lot as an evidence base as to how much those communities are beginning to lean into our issue in a really sort of empathetic way.
Yeah. Great, thank you so much, Mohammed. We're going to open it up to the floor now.
Yeah. Susan Banky, University of Sydney. Refugee scholars have had a bit of a luxury for many decades to critique the role of religious-based organizations in humanitarian aid, and particularly in refugee resettlement in the United States. And that luxury is either dying or becoming ever more pressing because it strikes me, Mohammed, that the role of faith-based organizations in refugee resettlement in the United States and humanitarian aid more broadly in the United States is going to become increasingly important. I don't want to suggest that all religious organizations go into communities with savior complexes. I mean, the refugee scholarship is more complex than that.
Right.
But when you talk about that 1/3 of the United States, for example, having encounters with refugees, I'm still thinking, but even many of those kinds of encounters are at their churches, or there's a missionary element to that.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm struggling. If that's the best we can do, what do we make of that? How do we Yeah, how do we build that bridge? I'll just bring in the theme of the conference, to work with faith-based organizations to create as much respectful, empowering, not savior ways of refugee protection. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks. Do you want to jump?
Can I take that question? Sure. Yeah, it's a really important question. It actually strikes to the heart of the matter of understanding who your audience base is. You know, in communications work, I learned very, very early on that your target audience must have to be the protagonist in the story that you tell. I'll say that again. Your target audience must become the protagonist in the sort of the narrativizing of the stories you tell. And so when thinking about faith-based institutions, what is interesting is that, at least in the US context, the levels of religiosity recede the further left you go on the ideological spectrum. The levels of religiosity start to increase very significantly as you move more towards the conservative end of the spectrum. What is also interesting is that middling segment that I spoke to you about, they actually have fairly high levels of religiosity as well. And so for us, it was tactical and strategic to invest in infrastructure that enabled a greater degree of contact between, say, religious communities and just other refugee populations and so forth. And at the same time, our resettlement agencies are entirely of that bent, right? And so it's just the way that the architecture has been set up around resettlement in the United States, which, for what it's worth, has been severely undermined and dismantled, and will be even further so. But I think religious communities have an important place in this conversation, not because of their scale. It's actually because they are speaking to a constituency that is extraordinarily vital to the political future of the country, and in our ability to stress test our own sort of the persuasiveness of our own messages and of our own ideas. And I think that holds quite a bit of sway, certainly in Washington, but also elsewhere around the country. And so I think we need religious institutions in the same way that we need refugee-led organizations, in the same way that we need employers and so forth. But I always go back to audience. That's where my mind goes. And so if there's an audience case to be made, then let's go have at it.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Mohammed. Graham?
Hi, yeah. Yes, we are working. Hi again, Mohammed.
Hey,
always
nice
great
to
to hear from you. Graham Tom from Refugee Council of Australia. First point I want to make when you talk about polarisation, particularly in the US, I think we have the luxury here in Australia that we have compulsory voting,
right.
So the middle have to vote, and we have preferential voting, so that tends to work against the extremes as well. It's not to say it's not happening in Australia, but we do have a system that hopefully helps mitigate against that. Yet at the same time, you highlighted, how do we make good policy visible? Right. We still, even with a left-leaning government, have a government that's very happy to talk about their hardline approaches, but won't say anything about any positive actions they're taking whatsoever, and they don't want refugees to be visible in the narrative at all, even when they're doing positive things. So how do we change that? How do we take on that sort of, what did you call it, alternative reality of mass migration causing all the social ills and actually make good policy visible?
Yeah, that's a really, really insightful question. So what's interesting is that governments, whether liberal or whether progressive or conservative, I go back to the nationalization of this issue in a way that I think has in some way undermined our ability to be able to convey our sort of advocacy. What that has left is that in the context of the United States, for example, Democrats saw talking about the issue as political kryptonite. It was very, they thought, corrosive to their political standing. So what they did, they made a very deliberate choice in making this. They made a deliberate choice to effectively recede from talking about this issue. Well, here's the thing about politics. You might not want to talk about it, but they're going to talk about it. And when you recede narratively, you effectively allow one camp of idea making. You effectively allow one camp to overwhelmingly take over the way in which the public begins to sort of interpret what is happening around them. Why is that? That a voter in Michigan, one of the most northern states, if not the most northern state in America, cares more about the US southern border than someone even at the US southern border. That makes no material sense. But the reason is because information has no borders. Misinformation has no borders. And so when you have governments, or parties rather, and elected officials in leadership, when they recede from amplifying and telling the most honest and true and evidence-based story, when they recede from that, there are other forces that will take advantage of that. And that has happened in the United States. It has happened in Germany. It has happened in the United Kingdom. It has happened across democracies. And I would actually challenge that ethos, whether it is actually good policy, because I don't think it's good policy, or rather, is it just an attempt to maintain hold of power? And the thing about power is you might not have it all the time. And so if you lose that power, then effectively you've now really risked the future of the system that we so care about. It's actually, it's a lazy evaluation when people recede in that way. And what we are trying to do, at least in the US context, is to advise and arm and support and complement our elected officials and other leadership across the United States to take a more formidable stance in talking about what Daniel shared in his remarks, which is we can establish order in our country while doing so in a way that retains our empathetic quality. And I think that is something that I think we have to continue to espouse, continue to sort of declare again and again and again. But when I've seen it time and time again, when elected officials recede from talking about it, that does not mean that the issue will not be talked about.
Thanks, Mohammed.
Yep.
Paul.
Sorry. Paul Power, also from the Refugee Council
Hey,
of
Paul.
Australia.
Nice to see you, Paul.
Good to see you.
Yeah.
I just actually wanted to affirm two of the things that you've said. One, about the question of the nationalisation of refugee policy. And from an Australian perspective, we can see that really clearly. We can see that in New South Wales here, in that the state government, which was conservative until 2.5 years ago, but was in power for about 12 years or so, was more progressive on refugee issues than the Labor Party at the national level, because they were seeing the impacts of bad policy at the local level. And so we've actually, quite a few of us in the room have had more successful engagement with the New South Wales Liberal Party than we've had with the Federal Labor Party on some of the issues affecting people seeking asylum. Because if policy is handled badly, the New South Wales government sees it through its policing, through its homelessness services, in the emergency departments of its hospitals. And so we've been able to collectively argue that case and actually, had for a period of time, and hopefully that may be coming back again, the New South Wales government actually putting resources into supporting people seeking asylum. The New South Wales Liberal Party doing it at odds with the federal Liberal government. So that's one thing we definitely affirm that, and the more local you get, the more likely people are in Australian politics, the less likely they are to see issues related to refugees in a party political context and more in a local context. So local government and state governments are actually not always, but in many cases, more likely to be supportive of refugees than the federal government is. And similarly, the challenge for us is the same in terms of the Conservative side of politics has been setting the agenda on refugee policy in Australia since 2000 or 2001 in particular. So the challenge for us is never to take our eyes off trying to influence the Conservative, or the Liberal and National parties in Australia, because even at the moment they're at their lowest ebb historically in federal politics, but they're still setting the agenda. Yeah. So the question for us is, how do we engage them in a constructive way? How do we actually communicate in terms of religious values that, welcoming the stranger is fundamental if you're Christian, Jewish or Muslim, that Australia has a fantastic positive record through refugee resettlement, not necessarily on asylum, over decades, and most of the time the resettlement has occurred under Conservative governments in Australia. Yeah. So, the importance of us being able to not to see refugee concerns as a progressive concern, but actually as a concern that anyone who shares decent human values actually wants to affirm and be a part of.
Yeah.
Thanks, Paul. Maybe we can take a few questions.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. 100%.
I think that's in the front here.
Okay, thank you, Mohammed, for the presentation. My name is Luendo. I'm coming from the University of Tasmania, so I'm a PhD student there. So in your presentation, you touched on the issue of polarized global aid infrastructure. Yeah. So I was interested to hear about it. So I'm sure we all acknowledge that fact. So now that that is the situation, what are the practical innovations or ideas to fill that gap? Because this is a huge challenge towards the protection of refugees. Yeah. And as you answer that question, if you can also touch on the promises of the Global Compact on refugees, just your perspectives on that. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks. So, Mark, we've got 1 minute to go in the session, so it's a very big question for you to answer.
I'm ready to break it down. Yeah, I'll turn it into a... So the question on the former, it's really hard to replace close to $40 billion every given year. Does the Australian government want to input $40 billion infuse? No. Do Gulf countries want to do that? When I think about the global aid architecture, I just don't think of it in the context of what the United States has decided on. I also think about what the European Union has decided on. I think about the way in which aid has been slowly being sort of more transactionally articulated across the world in efforts to curb migration. One of the most prime examples is just the way that the European Union worked with provided resourcing to the Tunisian government to curb migration, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's being kind of manipulated to be able to assuage the concerns of governments that are more hostile to displaced populations coming sort of to their, or integrating into their societies. In terms of who can fill that gap, frankly, I don't know right now as to who will fill that gap. It is a very, very, financially, it's quite large. I will also add that some of the innovations in the space, for example, have been, to go back to Sudan, the Emergency Response Room Network in Sudan, which is one of the most extraordinary stories of ingenuity and innovation. A network of community kitchens that are feeding tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Sudanese displaced populations all across the country. And they have not gotten the kind of notoriety and support. They were actually up for a Nobel. They didn't receive it, unfortunately, although a very, very worthy winner in Venezuela. But it's just to say that I think, really thinking through the ways in which, and study and celebrate and amplify the ways in which refugee networks, refugee-led organizations, solutions that are baked into the sort of proximal context of those conflicts and realities, the ways in which they have had to fill that gap because they have had no other choice to do so. And I think our challenge and our opportunity here is to be able to spotlight them, to be able to attract attention towards them so that both the multilateral institutions can benefit from their expertise, but I think more importantly that they can be in the driver's seat at receiving the kinds of resources that they fundamentally need to be able to expand their operations, rather than sort of national or international bodies coming in and flying in to be able to sort of displace them, which is the most ironic thing of all things. And then just on the global compact we're coming on several different kinds of sort of challenge points. We'd even talk about asylum, we didn't talk about all these sorts of issues, but I will sort of land where you landed, Daniel, which is, and I know we have to go, the asylum system is under attack, fundamentally, in the most direct way. And it is something that the United States has announced that it is willing and wanting to work with other governments directly, sidestepping UNHCR, in being able to actualize their vision for what asylum is and what it is not. Again, it's baked on falsehoods and misperceptions. We, I think as advocates, not just here in Australia, but certainly in all parts of the world, we seriously have to wrestle with what to do about that political posture. These governments are flying at the seat of speed, at a breakneck speed. And I think we are just sort of playing catch up. We cannot play catch up. This is not that moment. Like, this will happen, and it is happening. And we have to figure out a way to be able to bridge with other advocates across the world, both in Africa, in Asia, in the United States, Western Hemisphere, et cetera. We have to build a more global consortium of thinking around how to protect the system. The system is not broken, it is burdened. It is overburdened. And the asylum system has gotten to the place that it has gotten because it has been materially disadvantaged over decades. And so we have to both figure out how to narrativize this, and in the same vein of thought, we have to figure out how to be able to navigate these realities in the context of both Geneva and otherwise.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. I think it's a fantastic place for us to end with, and we managed to weave in the theme of the conference in terms of building bridges, but also actionable steps we can take going forward. For those of you who had questions on slide or on the floor that we didn't get to, I'm very sorry, but there will be opportunities. We'll be touching on a lot of these themes in the upcoming panels, so we can discuss those questions there, or you can, for those in the room, you can grab Mohammed over the break. But please join me again in thanking Mohammed.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much.